So Ukraine there's a lot to learn, but Ukraine has really impressive command and control software. So Delta, Veja, SkyMap, Graphite, Neon, all these systems, right? They're very, very good for situational awareness. And the U.S. has its own system. I got out of the military a long time ago, so things that I don't know, but I think there are a lot of these systems, the software they have. I think this would make a lot of sense for a lot of NATO militaries too, and it provides very good situational awareness at the lower level, where guys on their phones, on their laptops, have access and kind of can basically do mission planning, can look at where Russian targets are. They can have very good situational awareness what their adjacent units are doing. Veja is this app that streams all UAV footage, and so it's not just you; it's also your higher unit, your subordinate unit attached, adjacent units. You can see all this footage, and maybe 50, 60 UAVs on one part of the front line, and it just gives you a really tremendous kind of situational awareness. In some cases, you don't need to do as much coordination because you can see what adjacent unit's seeing, and then you can, if you're an artillery unit, you can decide to fire a mission based on your other, your adjacent unit's kind of UAV footage, or send FPVs or what have you. And so I think that's been really impressive to see how they do this. The mentality is different too, because with the software, it's pushed down to a much lower level than the U.S. military would be comfortable with, because we're much more comfortable, much more focused on kind of classified information leaking. And it's a bigger concern. But I do think it is an important kind of discussion to have about what is the risk and benefit of pushing down more information at the lowest level, because you enable decentralized operations to a way that we can't do right now. And I think in potentially Lithuania's case, this probably makes more sense. And I think a lot of what Ukraine is doing. And again, if you compare, to what extent should Lithuania learn from the U.S. military, Ukrainian military, there's probably a lot of things that they should learn from the Ukrainian military more than the U.S. military in some cases. The way they're fighting, obviously, Russia is the same kind of threat, but it's a smaller country fighting a bit bigger country. They show how to do this. So anyway, there's a number of really interesting things they do. There are also some things that we shouldn't learn from, I think, that might be particular to their case. Maybe doesn't make sense from NATO, maybe doesn't make sense for the U.S. military or so on. And so it's really important kind of drawing back these lessons and kind of figuring out, okay, what makes sense for us, what doesn't make sense for us, and how should we kind of draw back these lessons?
Now, looking, you have the privilege and benefit watching the war from very close distance, watching for the far distance, like here in Lithuania. At least I have one simple rule. Do not get overly optimistic. That's since 2022, especially since the counterattacks, Ukrainian counterattacks, successful ones. And then don't get into despair. How does that work in 2026 for you? You're more an optimist or pessimist, in between? Where do you draw the line here?
Sure. So Russia's had this initiative since 2023, right? So since October, November 2023. Where they've been, broadly on offense, and Ukraine has been on defense. The good news is that Russia has not achieved a breakthrough, right? Russia has advanced. They've captured some cities. They've captured territory, but they have not broken through. There hasn't been a collapse, anything along those lines. The good news is, and there's a lot of talk about, is it a turning point? Is Ukraine winning? Are they losing? How do you frame it? I don't like those terms because
from the media, I know the click bites.
Right.
So
it's difficult because they have connotations, and so it really depends what you mean. So when we say turning point, for example, is Ukraine now? Do they now have the initiative? Right? Are they now going to be mostly taking back territory and Russia's on defense? Maybe, but it's not fully clear we're at that point yet. Because right now we're seeing Ukraine counterattacking some directions, we're seeing Russia advance in other directions. I do think, though, the dynamic is better now than it was a year ago. And so, one thing I mentioned is that there's a really strong seasonal dimension to the fighting. Russia prefers infiltration tactics. That means, 1, 2, 3 Russian soldiers are moving forward at a time, often 10, 15, 20 kilometers of walking. And in the summertime, right, when you've got foliage, when you have tree lines, it's harder for UAVs to spot these guys. So a higher percentage of these guys will make it past Ukrainian lines. It's easy to survive, obviously. If you're not getting as much food and water, you can dig in tree lines, right? Whereas in the wintertime, it's a very cold winter, you have to find a basement to survive. And so we knew that infiltration typically is better suited to summer months than it is winter months. And so we knew this, this winter, when Russia was advancing slower, that was normal. The question is, when the foliage comes back, are their advances still going to decline, or are they going to increase again? And we're not seeing an increase in Russia rate advance, right? And that's the good news. That basically, compared to a year ago, the situation very clearly is better. We're into the summer, and Russia is not advancing faster. We're seeing Ukraine kind of push back in some directions. Ukraine is intercepting a higher percentage of Shaheds right now, so they're doing quite well with that. Ballistic missile defense is obviously the big problem they have. But on the front line, generally, the situation is better than it was a year ago. Manpower is still a big challenge, and the Ukrainian units know this. I think the situation has probably improved a little bit, but it's still, a vulnerability. There are indications that Russia's having issues with their recruitment. So I think they are recruiting more soldiers than they're losing this year, but not significantly. And so they can probably sustain, the current kind of intensity of fighting if the trend continues. But the trend right now is not enabling it's not a decisive advantage. It's not enabling any kind of rapid advances. I think Ukraine has figured out at tactical level the two kind of big adaptations Russia had last year, which is infiltration tactics, one, and two, this kind of improved employment of UAVs, and in particular with more elite units, really going after kind of tactical interdiction, trying to go after Ukraine logistics. When they did this last year, it was a really big problem in Kursk and other places. And Ukrainian units have figured this out. They know how to do logistics now. They know how to kind of defend against this. And so, Russia really needs to change its approach. It's not clear if they know how to do this. I think what's interesting this year is that both sides kind of concluded that some kind of operational depth strike campaign was going to be a priority. And so, sorry.
No, it's okay. I thought we were going to come back to the interdiction campaign that you just mentioned, but one of the key aspects that you probably didn't touch, but you were speaking before, others also were talking about that, it's a manpower issue, manpower problem in the Ukrainian side. And recently it's being compensated in a way, at least people say that it's being compensated by the UAVs, UGVs, USVs, etc., etc. The sort of proponents and opponents, they often clash in their opinions, and one side says that, well, the drones, largely, broadly, they cannot hold terrain, but they can deny terrain. They can resupply, they can be used for various tasks today, and yet they are not enough. Is this a thing that the manpower issue being solved by these systems truly prevailing sort of a trend? Is that a way forward, or is that just a Ukrainian and Russian way forward in this particular war?
So the fighting is positional, and so you've had the development of the kill zone and this kind of the dynamic. Let's keep in mind that in 2022 this is not the case. And if there's a new war, right, where Russia invades another country or so on, the kill zone is not going to exist, right? There's not going to be fortifications, not going to be these kind of things. You have this sophisticated system already set up, and maneuver will still be possible. And look, I think maneuver is still possible now. Drones are playing a really important role. As you said, Ukraine has very few infantry holding the front line, right? Drones are really compensating. In reality, drones are doing most of the holding the front line, responsible for most of the reconnaissance, most of the strike. Infantry, very few of the engagements are infantry and infantry fights. One of the core surgeons told me that about 2 or 3% of his casualties are from small arms, so it's very, very small percentage. And so drones are really compensating, but this also creates vulnerabilities, right? And so traditional way, way I was taught, way you do defense, for an infantry unit, you have fire teams, squad positions, you have crew serve weapons, you have interlocking fields of fire with machine guns and like mortars and ATGMs. You don't have that anymore, right? Because drones have kind of just, supplanted a lot of those things. And so Ukraine will have, obviously don't have any infantry. They don't necessarily have infantry with, tied in positions. They don't necessarily have it, a defense in depth either. There aren't like necessarily, medium, heavy machine gun positions. And mortars, usually it's 120s, less than that, they don't always have them. The same thing is true on the Russian side. And so for Russian defenses, I don't think Russian lines are that strong. And that's one reason why I think, it's potential that Ukraine could, have some success if they go on offense. Because, Russia, they have a manpower advantage. Their forward-line infantry is not that strong. They don't really spend too much time training their infantry. You get, a few weeks. The front line is kind of held by UAVs. It's by Mavics, by FPVs. And assumption Ukraine lacks the offensive potential manpower to really, conduct an offensive operation. But, Russia doesn't necessarily have, again, the medium machine gun positions. They don't have the ATGM position necessarily. Their tanks and IFVs are far behind. They're not used as an infantry role as much. And they don't necessarily have a second line, third line of defenses, right? So this conception of the 2023 summer offensive, where Russia had 2 kilometers of minefields, and then they had very dense fortifications. You had lots of infantry, lots of guys rotate. They don't have that the same way anymore because they're focused on offense. Russian units are given unrealistic timetables of how fast they're supposed to advance, and they're kind of throwing guys forward in order to kind of make up with this. And so, if you can sufficiently degrade, suppress, destroy drone positions, there's no reason you can't use armor again, right? And I think that's the kind of point I'm making, where drones are playing a very important role. But it's also vulnerability because they aren't relying on those other kind of traditional forms of defense, and it's not impossible to suppress drone teams. It's not impossible to locate them. It really is. We're in this kind of moment, which I kind of compare to World War I. It's not a great analogy, but FPVs, when they came initially, I think they really favored defense. It's easier to defend with them. You don't need as much kind of coordination. But to go on offense, you need new tactics, maybe some other new technologies like counter UAV turrets, which are also developing. But I think those things are coming along. We're seeing the kind of innovation also on task organization, where, and this is one thing that's notable, the Ukrainian assault regimes, the ratio of drone operators, drone teams to infantry is often like 3 or 4 to 1, right?
Laidos pilna apimtim ir didžiulio archyvo ieškokite Patreon arba Substack arba Contribui kanale, kuris taip ir vadinasi Algis Ramanauskas. Laidą remia įkrautas elektromobilių įkrovimo sprendimai, saulės elektrinės ir energijos kaupikliai jūsų namams ar verslui.